The build-up to World War III coincided with the rise of China, the decline of Russia, and the general chaos in the Middle East. All issues that could be traced back to the very First World War, with some going back to the middle of the 19th century. Some would call the prologue to the Third World War the end of the Cold War, with the collapse of the Soviet Union in particular leading to the emergence of several new states in Europe and Asia. The tensions brought about by this collapse would culminate in 2008 with the controversial invasion of Georgia and eventually the first failed invasion of Ukraine by Russia. A war that would see Russian influence almost entirely expelled from Europe, with Russian forces pushed out of Ukraine in only a few months, bringing to light the growing Russo-Indian split. Furthermore, the sheer failure led to ethnic uprisings across Europe in response. However, the uprisings would largely fail, humiliating the aging Putin even more while pushing the country in the direction of authoritarian militarism. Furthermore, Ukraine was angered as well, as the Russians would keep Crimea under their control to allow them port access, greatly enraging the people of the region. These events pushed Russia closer and closer to the growing People's Republic of China, which dreamed of becoming the next world hegemon and dominating the Eurasian continent. Now, under the leadership of President Xi Jinping, China was undergoing mass militarization, which included a rampant expansion of the Chinese Navy both at home, across the Pacific, and beyond. Through political manipulation and the right amount of purges, Xi Jinping had turned his 5-year presidential term into a lifetime one, or as he'd later be remembered as, the Emperor of the late Red Dynasty. This title was not unjustly earned, as Xi would aspire to reclaim many lost lands and privileges of the old dynasties, first and foremost of which being the island nation of Taiwan and the return of China's long-held status as the center of the world. At the same time, China would expand its influence throughout the Third World through initiatives such as the Belt and Road, which some called modern-day colonialism. All of this worried the current global superpower, the United States, as well as regional rivals like Japan, who in recent years had started fighting an undeclared naval war with the Chinese, remilitarizing after many decades of officially having no military. The US would swiftly join in on the build-up, leading to an arms race between America and China. This rapid remilitarization would be met with nervous hesitation from many of Japan's allies, most notably South Korea, who, while making sure to maintain their large military presence along the Korean border, became more hesitant to show support of Japanese actions in the Pacific, particularly as they became more economically connected to Beijing and also due to general distrust between the two states. However, both would remain firmly in the American sphere of influence, maintaining close diplomatic, strategic, and economic ties with America, such that if war was to break out on the Korean peninsula, it would surely spill into a wider conflict. As China and America waged their silent Cold War, both grew concerned of another rising power on the continent, just to the south of China. India too had its own aspirations of becoming a major player on the world stage, and in recent years had also started growing closer to the US. Chinese closeness with Russia had also resulted in India growing distant from its traditional friends in Moscow, while growing closer to Tokyo and Washington. The sitting Hindu nationalist Prime Minister Narendra Modi wasn't exactly stable at present due to gaffes under previous administrations, as well as Modi's increasing turn towards authoritarianism in order to quell dissent regarding many of the more questionable aspects of his rule, leading to many in the US being distrusting towards the rising power. This rise in power and this shift away from their traditional Russian friends was unacceptable to the ruling CCP as well as neighboring Pakistan, who are also dealing with severe ethnic tensions, much like Russia and China, eventually leading to a revolution within its borders that saw a new regime under the Committee for Public Safety take over in response to the Afghanistan border conflict with the Taliban. Ethnic tensions only continued to rise as war broke out in the Middle East between the Arab nations and Iran, out of distaste for growing Persian hegemony in the region, with both India and Russia trying to fill the void left by the retreating Americans, with ethnic tensions in the region serving as the prime catalyst for the coming war to break out. Yet, despite all of these tensions, in the years before, few actually believed that war would break out. Diplomacy seemed like the rule of the day between the great powers ever since the mid-1940s, partially due to rising fears of nuclear destruction. Contradictory ideas that any war between great powers would go nuclear, combined with ABMs and anti-nuclear treaties, led many to assume that there likely wouldn't be a war, or that it would be a quick one with few radical changes. For now, it seemed like proxy wars and economic competition would continue to be the rule of the day, as globalism meant that no one wished to threaten the economic interconnection that had made the world prosper. But then, everything changed. On June 28, 2024, Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin made a controversial visit to Crimea to inspect Russian troop garrisons, only to find himself killed by a Ukrainian nationalist group. Almost immediately, Russian President Vladimir Putin blamed Kiev for having involvement in the assassination, while accusing them of being a state sponsor of terrorism at the UN, beginning to make plans to go to war. However, he could not immediately march off to war. Chinese President Xi urged the Russians to try diplomacy first, while also promising to back Putin in whatever happened next, not wanting more market disruptions like the last war Moscow blundered into. At the same time though, Xi secretly feared encirclement by the Western powers and the rising India to the south. Unfortunately for everyone, Putin desired nothing more than to make up for his humiliation in Ukraine. Over the course of July, Russia sent a list of impossible demands to the Ukrainians, knowing fully well that he left them with only two choices. Or they would resist, which would allow him to declare war, or they would cooperate and essentially turn into a Russian vassal. Despite desires to cooperate and avert a second war, Ukraine chose the former, and Russia would start the conflict. Now paranoid that the Russo-Chinese alliance was up to no good, India had begun to mobilize its forces into a state of readiness, which China would interpret as an act of aggression and demand that Delhi stand down. When the Indians refused, China declared war. Japan, by now fully remilitarized and knowing that China viewed them as being as much of a threat as India, also began mobilizing, fearing they would be next. And, as many predicted, China did indeed declare war on Japan as well, after their ultimatum was rejected. In the West, however, the formerly NATO states remained neutral. Both the US and Europe had seen rises in anti-war sentiment as of late, and they weren't interested in getting involved, with the US specifically seeing getting involved as likely leading to ruin for the US due to lingering war fatigue, while the latter had too many internal issues, a low military budget, and deep connections with the Eastern powers to deal with, leaving NATO a severely weakened alliance in spite of their previous quick victory in Ukraine. However, the US would not remain neutral for long. The People's Liberation Army had come up with a plan to win the war quickly. This plan, known as the Fang plan, called for securing the East Asian weak points of Taiwan and Japan first, as Japan was a fully modernized force who, if allowed to fully mobilize, could potentially make themselves unassailable due to being an island nation. Taiwan, on top of sharing the same issues from being an island, could also serve as a point from which its enemies could attack the mainland, not to mention the very real need to finish the Chinese Civil War. With the swift securing of the East, the Chinese would then be able to focus their efforts entirely on India, who they presumed would be more disorganized and take far longer to mobilize. So, as China declared war and moved its forces onto Taiwan, Beijing released an ultimatum to South Korea, as the plan also called for pushing through the Korean peninsula and using it as a beachhead from which to invade Japan. China had assumed that, due to economic connections, South Korea would simply allow them to pass through, but instead, Seoul would refuse this demand, seeing it as an obvious breach of its sovereignty. As a result, the Chinese launched an invasion of the South alongside their North Korean allies the day after their invasion of Taiwan. Despite the PLA anticipating strong anti-war sentiment in their enemies, making them likely to hesitate, the United States declared war on China immediately for invading their allies, deploying their troops to Japan. However, apart from Canada and Britain, the other NATO states would stay out of the war for now. Before the year was over though, war would spread to other continents. Ethiopia, following a shift in their government and foreign policy away from their traditional Eastern allies in favor of the West, would join the conflict on the side of the Allies, to attack pro-Chinese states in the region, annexing Eritrea, and swooping in to replace the Chinese foothold in East Africa with their own initiatives. In South Asia, India would mobilize and attack quicker than China expected, but they were unable to get very far into the Himalayas. Russia, meanwhile, would find itself diverting troops to assist its satellite of Kazakhstan against pro-Western, pro-Indian states in Central Asia, where its troops would find themselves getting bogged down and humiliated once more, with Indian-advised troops putting them on the run and preventing them from focusing all of their efforts on Ukraine, where they would continue to struggle. After defeating the Allied troops in Korea, the Chinese would make attempts at landing in Japan. But while the well-equipped Japanese army initially seemed incompetent, and even with US help was unable to stop the PLA advance, they would mostly repel the Chinese from their shores with American aid, pushing the Chinese back to Korea with their own landings. The US, Japanese, and South Koreans attempted to outflank the Chinese like they did in the First Korean War, while the Chinese and North Koreans attempted to isolate the South by attacking ports and declaring a no-fly zone over Korea, to stop the US from deploying effectively. In a sick twist of irony, trenches would be dug on the peninsula as they were in the First Korean conflict 7 decades prior. The Chinese would also fortify their own coast to repel any attempted invasion against them. While the stalemate had set in, the Fang plan had failed, and China now found itself in the long war of attrition its leaders had hoped to avoid. Now, due to the same reasons that many thought that war would not come at all, the war would remain conventional but far from short. Advanced multi-million-dollar weapon systems were used early on in an attempt to end the war quickly, only to be countered by cheaper but easier to make hardware, leaving most of the work to be done by the ground forces with artillery and cheap suicide drones to back them up. Fighting became largely static as neither side could muster the forces necessary to break the other's lines. Both sides would aim to bring the hammer down on the other, bringing back the total war conditions unseen since the Second World War straight to the home front, with everyone having to contribute in some way, whether it be new manufacturing jobs or even war bonds, or militarily, as things had gotten so bad that both the US and Chinese militaries would implement a draft to boost their reserves, leading to unrest, particularly in the US. Of course, many horrible new weapons would be used in this conflict, with the Chinese using orbital bombardments against Japanese and even American cities on the west coast, with primitive space and satellite warfare taking place in orbit. Both sides would also utilize nukes and dirty bombs on the field, turning the Asian front into a radioactive wasteland, with radiation sickness being a common cause of death in the war, and soldier gear now including heavy amounts of radiation protection. Major cities would largely be spared out of fear of total annihilation, as either by luck or through a brief moment of lucidity in the midst of the horrific Third World War, the two sides agreed not to launch their whole arsenals to glass the enemy. At the same time, the US ramped up their blockade of the Straits of Malacca, which combined with the out-of-touch decision by the Chinese military to invest so heavily into the Indian front, would lead to famines on the Chinese mainland, while the US could more comfortably count on its own resources to keep their allies supplied. In response to the American blockade, the People's Liberation Army Navy began a submarine campaign in an effort to starve Japan and counteract Allied naval supremacy, attacking American ships in the Pacific. But this Chinese action would come at a cost, specifically having an adverse effect on the economies and diplomacy with neutral nations, particularly Europe, whose ships were increasingly threatened when they violated the Chinese naval quarantine. Now meanwhile, on the subcontinent front, with India struggling against Chinese troops, its arch-rival of Pakistan would seize the opportunity to get in deep with their Chinese benefactors. Fearing that this new front on the subcontinent would divert much-needed Indian men away from the Chinese, the US opted to try a decapitation strike and organize landings at Karachi, along with allies from Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, in an attempt to secure the subcontinent for the Allied powers. However, due to American incompetence and Pakistani defenses proving sturdier than anticipated, the troops would find themselves pinned down and eventually defeated after 8 months of stalemate. Despite this victory though, Pakistan would see little success elsewhere. But rather than re-evaluating their forces, the military government in Pakistan blamed ethnic minorities within their borders, particularly those in Balochistan, where an ongoing insurgency was making headlines, leading to Pakistan committing horrific acts of ethnic cleansing on the Balochi population. After much internal debate, Turkey would join the war on the west side, hoping to gain dominance over the Black Sea and the Caucasus, only to find itself in a stalemate on the latter front line. This would be further compounded by Iran joining the Eastern powers in hopes of gaining hegemony over the Middle East. Iranian entry would force American troops and aid to be diverted away from Ukraine's overwhelmed military, resulting in it finally falling to Russian forces. However, the far west of Ukraine would remain free and find itself filled with American reinforcements who accessed the country via Turkey, allowing the fight to keep on going in the face of a genocidal Russian occupation. On the main fronts, things stabilize, with India halting the Chinese advance into their territory. Back in East Asia, the Chinese would attempt to make another amphibious landing near the Japanese city of Fukuoka, which had been heavily saturated with suicide drone attacks laced with radioactive material, which the Japanese fought off to the best of their ability. The siege of Fukuoka would go down as one of the darkest battles of the war, but would also be remembered dearly in Japanese history as the next successful repulsion of a foreign invasion. Other nations around the world would soon start to join sides in the war, with the Eastern powers in particular attempting to cultivate friends in the Third World to open up new front lines. Many Eastern allies fell early on due to weak and unpopular governments or weak militaries, quickly getting pounced on by their neighbors with American help. Others would simply fall because the Chinese or Russians couldn't support them, while the Americans could do likewise with their own allies, leading to these Chinese partners being, at best, minor distractions. In Venezuela, an attempt by the government to join the war by invading Guyana saw the nation break apart into civil war, with both sides heavily equipped by opposing factions of the war, bringing more tragedy to a dying nation. But surprisingly, Maduro's government largely lasted until the end of the war, rather than completely capitulating like Niger did against ECOWAS, leaving it one of very few minor Chinese allies to technically last until the end. Many other nations around the world would help by supplying manpower to the main nations, that is, assuming they weren't busy settling accounts with their neighbor. Now the next year of fighting would see continued stalemate. US Special Forces would support rebels in Pakistan, making promises for freedom from the military government, although, in secret, the US and Japan worked together to divide up the dying nation's resources for future use by American, Japanese companies. Now as the East Asian front continued to grind down, and Turkey was starting to feel increasing Russian pressure, India would launch the Mandri offensive, which saw a major push deep into Chinese lands, only to be halted by a lack of supplies. In August of that same year, America would sway Saudi Arabia into joining the war on their side, due to long-standing tensions with the Iranians. Early Saudi advances would quickly be swept away when the Iranians launched a devastating invasion of the region, capturing Riyadh. Over in Korea, the US would attempt its own push against the Chinese to pull some heat away from the continuing front lines in Japan. This offensive would see the first deployment of combat exoskeletons to enhance the infantrymen on the battlefield. But it would prove to accomplish nothing, as poor planning saw the offensive end in tactical failure. By the end of 2026, things are looking grim for both sides. Several offensives, from Mantri to Fukuoka, have all ended with little gained by those launching them, only ending with millions dead and a severe loss of morale. Chaos had already taken over the stock markets as half of the major economic centers stopped trading, with the world economy effectively coming to a halt. China in particular began to feel the pain, as their shift to a wartime economy has not helped it recover from the loss of trade in the slightest. Xi's wartime policies, mixed with allied embargoes and blockades, began to cause widespread famine on the Chinese mainland, even in the major cities. Meanwhile, the Allies, while also hit badly by economic downturn, were still able to back themselves up with the still massive economy of the US, as well as the European Union continuing to secretly support the Allied powers in their war efforts. While still neutral, most in Europe were pro-Allied due to previously established economic and historical ties to the US. Because of these ties, the Chinese High Command agreed that an eventual European intervention was inevitable, especially as Russian society and government were visibly disintegrating under the strain of the war in the Caucasus. This was not helped by the death of Vladimir Putin, as his replacement was a man with shaky legitimacy amongst the oligarchs and the Russian people, especially after a failed attempt at negotiating a peace with the Allies involving, of all things, one of the members of the Ottoman imperial family. Fearing European intervention, a secret email was sent to the Serbian government, promising them historical Serb lands if they joined their side of the war. While Serbia rejected the offer, the email would be intercepted by the US and handed over to the European Union. This would cause a surge in popularity of the pro-federalist and interventionist elements within the EU, declaring war on the Eastern powers shortly after. However, the same year of 2027 would mark a turning point for India, who suffered greatly from unrest over the war, starting out as anti-war riots before becoming a full revolution that resulted in Modi being removed from power in favor of an interim government which opted to continue the war. However, the staunch refusal to end the unpopular war would see the shaky coalition government get overthrown by an even more radical movement influenced heavily by left-wing social justice ideals from the United States, as well as the ideology of technocracy, calling themselves the Equitists. What started as major uprisings in several cities culminated in yet another overthrow of the government, which sought to restructure India along more equitable lines. At the same time, the Equitists would negotiate with China, agreeing to cede land to their sphere in exchange for peace. Demoralized and surrounded, the Saudis would leave the war a few weeks later, signing an armistice which saw much of their east coast ceded to Iran, seemingly cementing them as the victor in their long-standing religious rivalry. The collapse of Saudi Arabia and India closed a major frontline for China, which worried many of the Allied powers initially, but a Chinese victory was not to be. In Europe, their domestic industry had seen a major build-up as a result of decreased trade from the war, resulting in the European industry rivaling pre-war China and giving the Allies the edge needed to make up for the loss of India. 2027 would also see the entry of Iraq on the side of the Allies less than a year later. Initially, Iraq had been conflicted over which side to join, as it had many pro-Iran and pro-American elements. After a brief national schism that saw the country break in two, the nation would come together again and join the Allies, after finding itself under intense pressure from the US, allowing for another offensive to begin against Iraq. However, for the average soldier on the ground, little seemed to be changing, and morale continued to drop. Japanese troops would famously start to mutiny against their officers, while Turkey would engage in political purges over its officers' incompetence, which only leads to Russia making more advances into Turkish territory. With the closing of the Indian front lines, China shifts its focus to Korea, hoping to close yet another front before the Europeans could bolster their foe's manpower or take advantage of the exposed Russian flank. The PLA and what remained of the KPA attempted a major offensive against the Allied powers, hoping to break them and secure Korea before European forces could arrive in bulk. While some land was gained, it wouldn't be enough, as not only did European forces stabilize the Allies in Korea, there would also be a push into Russia, seizing Kaliningrad and forcing the diversion of Russian forces from the east, pushing the Eastern powers back even more. Stalemates existing for years across the world would now begin to break. Euro forces intervened in the Middle East alongside the US and Turkey, pushing into Iran alongside Iraq, and Saudi Arabia would even re-enter the war at the last second to reclaim lost land. Iran, exhausted, opted to surrender in the face of these invasions. Pakistan and Russia would both also see government and societal collapse as their enemies closed in on both sides, with Euro forces entering Afghanistan and the US making landings in the Far East to reinforce the Vladivostok front, with both of the former Chinese allies falling to revolutions as minorities across their nations declared their own nation-state. To complete the process, a mutiny amongst the Chinese Navy, which refused to face the US Navy in a suicide attack, evolved into a popular revolution on mainland China. Yunnan would declare independence in a popular revolt, and Chinese President Xi Jinping stepped down in the face of a revolution at home after suffering a severe mental health episode and needing to be replaced by his advisor, with the Chinese government now opting to make peace. With the war over, the victors of the war would meet in Kyoto to discuss a peace treaty. Equitist-run India would be ignored due to already having signed a separate peace, as well as due to being in the middle of a civil war. The representatives from the EU would call for the restructuring of the United Nations to prevent another major war. However, the US and Japan, the latter of which was still recovering from the use of dirty weaponry on its land and the massive population loss, sought to weaken China and ensure that it wouldn't be a threat. However, at the same time, America still wanted China to reintegrate into the global economy and get its still massive industry and manufacturing base ready for the global economy. The Chinese would not actually have a say in the terms of the treaty, which would be signed on November 11th of 2028. The Eastern powers would be forced to pay for all damages they had caused during the war, particularly China, who would also see their massive military shrunk to a skeleton form, as well as being forced to accept collective guilt for the conflict. At the same time, China would lose Tibet and Xinjiang, and both would become independent states, while, most insultingly, Guangxi, Hainan, and other minor territories would be ceded to neutral Vietnam. The Russian Federation was dissolved along regional and ethnic lines, breaking its power forever, though it had the minor consolation of seeing minimal fighting on its own territory, meaning much of its manufacturing base and infrastructure remained intact. Turkey, though, would feel snubbed by the negotiations, as their desired sphere of influence over the former Russian Caucasus and the Black Sea was denied by the new UN, which was seen as spitting in the face of the countless Turks dying during the war. Pakistan was to be divided up heavily between Japan and the US, though further plans to partition its territory, such as giving Afghanistan the Pashtun territories, would fail, as the nation would fight vigorously to maintain its independence. Such determination, it was decided, made further carving up Pakistan undesirable to the already exhausted Allied forces, and the new government, led by veterans of the war, would make great strides to separate itself from the authoritarian predecessor and create a true, unified Pakistani identity. The various minor Chinese allies across Africa would find themselves at the mercy of the UN and their neighbors. But the massive casualties of the war would soon be compounded by yet another pandemic that would break out and spread across the world over the course of the late 2020s, particularly hitting veterans of the war very, very hard. The world would also find itself heavily in debt, most of which went to the newly formed European Federation. In stark contrast to the sorry state of the rest of the world post-war, Europe would actually see a period of economic prosperity, and would very quickly rise to be the new economic power of the world, offering cheap loans to help rebuild the war-torn world. The Indian subcontinent would come to be dominated by the Equitists after their victory in the Civil War, forming an exhausted, war-torn state which looked outwards with hopes of uplifting the whole world, though quickly becoming a rogue state excluded from the UN out of fear of its ideology spreading. Just to the north, the new borders in Eurasia would lead to great disgruntlement, particularly in lands formerly dominated by the People's Republic of China, with new nations such as Tibet still holding large Han Chinese populations. On the Allied front, China and Russia's old UN Security Council seats had been replaced with Japan and Germany. The United States would maintain its foreign position as world policeman, although this time its interventions would be on behalf of the United Nations. Japan would focus its own UN policing on Asia, where they were largely left alone to handle the enforcement of the unpopular post-war treaties, which led to many on the continent fearing the resurgence of a Japanese empire, while South Korea found itself stuck with a joint occupation duty with Japan of North Korea. In China, the economy would crash as the yuan underwent hyperinflation, partially as a result of pre-war and wartime Chinese economic failures catching up to the present, forcing them to halt war reparation, leading to Japan and Korea staging interventions into Manchuria to safeguard the money flowing into Seoul and Tokyo's Reconstruction Authority. Across China, revolutionaries were fighting in the street, with many equitist-inspired activists hoping to create a true republic for the people, which saw a violent response from PLA veterans which had formed roving death squads to enforce the rule of the new Wuhan Republic. However, despite the 2030s rough start, the Chinese economy would see some recovery with the help from American and European banks, easing tensions a bit, even allowing China back into the UN. Unfortunately, this would all be broken by a massive financial collapse in the year 2039. A financial crisis that would lead to the rise of radical politics and major suffering worldwide. Decades prior, Turkey would be one of the first to fall to radicalism. Behram Matarki would become the man to take the helm of Turkey following his ultra-nationalist march on Ankara in 2032, thereby becoming the founding father of modern ultra-nationalist ideologies. Mataraki would soon take total control over the nation, while promising to rebuild the glory of the Ottoman Empire, banning all domestic opposition in the process. China was the nation perhaps harshest hit by the Depression, with poverty exploding well above the 30% mark. Extremism would rise even worse than in Turkey, as the Wuhan Republic was held directly responsible for these failings. Fearing the rise of leftist extremists, the president, an old PLA general, would be given near dictatorial power. The 2042 election, though, would change everything, as we would see an explosive victory for the Party of Unity and Progress, and its leader, a Taiwanese-born Chinese man by the name of Han Hongzhi. Swiftly, Hongzhi would seize absolute power, and like Mataraki before him, banning all opposition, abolishing the Wuhan Republic, as well as leaving the UN and building up the Chinese military, much to the protest of the West. Hongzhi applied much blame for China's defeat on internal forces within China itself. One of these was the old Chinese elite, such as the corporate class, the CCP, and many other officials who got to their position through nepotism. He would use this as a platform to direct blame and hatred towards Chinese Christians for backstabbing the Chinese nation in its dire hour. However, this would soon expand into a general blame on Western ideologies, of which Hongzhi's definition was broad, involving not just equitists, but Abrahamics as well, with anyone following an Abrahamic faith being viewed as Western agents incapable of being true citizens of the Chinese state, with the Han Chinese being divine and destined to rule over all the other disorderly or dirty peoples of the world. Hongzhi would imagine a future with a grand, heavenly ordained, autocratic Chinese empire that spanned the Eurasian continent. One, obviously, with him as the new emperor. The 2040s would also see the beginning of new expansionism. Turkey would launch what it called a peacekeeping operation into neighboring Syria, causing the president to flee the nation and begging to the UN for help, never officially signing an armistice with the Turks and bogging them down in guerrilla war. Although, on the outside, there was the image of a resounding Turkish victory. This act would start to bring Turkey closer with China, who formed a strong bond in 2035. China would also find friends in Africa in the form of Ethiopia. Formerly regarded as irrelevant by most in the West, even during the Third World War, Ethiopia had now truly ascended on the world stage after its great success in the conflict, having taken over China's position as the main investor on the African continent, establishing a big sphere of influence over the east of the continent. However, Ethiopia had determined that its new mandates in Africa shall be permanent occupation. As of now, the country has been taken over by a hyper-militaristic military, against whom the civilian government is too weak to stop, with the majority of Ethiopians being behind their dreams of expansion and pan-African unity, longing to banish modern, Western capitalists from the continent, seeing it as a remnant of old colonialism, and being eager to fund any rebels who share this sentiment. This expansion would eventually culminate in an invasion of South Africa, which was already undergoing a civil war between government and equitist element. This invasion proved brutal, as despite promises of liberation, the Ethiopian army would engage in massacres, leading to widespread condemnation from the US and those outside. However, the most notable expansion in the eyes of the world would be in Asia. Recently, the Chinese military marched on the independent Islamic Republic of East Turkestan, which would see the nation once again dissolved into the Chinese nation. However, Hong Xi was able to reassure the United Nations that this was only a pragmatic move. After all, the Han Chinese in the region had outnumbered the native Uyghurs since the early 2030s. Ever since the annexation of East Turkestan, rumors have begun escaping of persecution against the ethnic Uyghurs. Very troublingly though, the UN seemed more interested in other affairs to raise all too much concern about this renewed Chinese xenophobia and expansionism. The next act of Chinese expansionism would be seen in the north, with the independent republics of Euralia and Siberia being carved out of the former Russian Federation at the end of the Third World War. These regions each possessed large and growing Chinese populations, especially in outer Manchuria. The United States and Japan would organize a conference in Xizang with the leaders of China and Turkey to discuss the fate of the Far East. It was agreed, after some negotiation, that China would be allowed to annex outer Manchuria, but in exchange would leave the rest of the Far East alone. US President Jimmy Donaldson would return to Washington, D.C., proudly waving the signature of Han Hongji and declaring on YouTube Live, "Peace in our time." However, not long after this declaration of peace, the Chinese would launch an invasion of Siberia and Euralia anyway, claiming it was necessary to disarm terrorist organizations operating in the nation. Both republics would be completely partitioned by Russia and China, with Inner Siberia becoming a Sino-protectorate. Today, in the year of 2049, the world stands in an uncertain place. Hong Xi has once again been threatening the Western powers, claiming hegemony over the independent Kingdom of Tibet. Once again, the United States and Japan have said that they will not stand for such acts of Chinese expansionism, but their threats are overshadowed by their prior acts of appeasement. China has left the United Nations and recently signed a non-aggression pact with India, enacting a protocol to formally divide the Asian subcontinent between spheres of influence between the two nations. The West also begins to fear that Ethiopian expansionism may threaten the French sphere of influence in Africa. Once again, war hangs over the world like a raven, and fears of yet another world war are abound amongst news stations, social media platforms, and day-to-day chatter. It seems like the world powers are destined to play the game of war once more, in a sickening, eternal loop. But what will come of this war, who shall survive it, and who shall emerge victorious, depends entirely upon the whims of those mighty and powerful in each of our major nations. Thank you all for watching. Credit for this video doesn't go to me, but it goes to Marklin, MangoFett, Confault, and Whiteshore. Thank you all for watching. Leave in the comments who you think each nation was supposed to be. Subscribe for more, and if you want to see the same concept but for World War I, Click on the video on top now.